There are moments in history when a single sentence spoken by a man in power carries more weight than 1,000 warnings shouted from rooftops. And when that man is the Pope, a figure revered by millions as the moral voice of faith, peace, and spiritual authority, his words aren't just statements, they're signals. And what was just admitted, what slipped past carefully crafted speeches and diplomatic phrases, is something that should shake you to your core. Because for those who've been paying attention, for those who can feel that unsettling energy thickening in the world, this wasn't just a message to the faithful, it was a warning to humanity dressed in the calm tone of a leader too seasoned to show fear. When I first heard it, my blood ran cold, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed what many have felt in their bones for years now, that something isn't right, that beneath the surface of peace talks, global unity campaigns, and harmless-sounding initiatives, there's a darker current moving, and the people at the top know it. And this wasn't some fringe theory or anonymous leak. This came from the mouth of the very man billions believe to be the closest thing to a divine authority on earth. When a figure of that magnitude admits something that hints at global consequences, you'd be a fool not to pay attention. He didn't scream it. He didn't dramatize it. He simply stated it in the kind of composed, measured tone you only hear from people who've already accepted what's coming. And that's what made it terrifying, because when those in power deliver bad news with calmness, it means one of two things. Either it's so far out of their control they've resigned themselves to it, or it's so deliberately orchestrated that there's no longer a need to hide it. The admission itself wasn't cloaked in mystery. It was clear enough for anyone willing to listen. It hinted at a future where lines between faiths blur, where moral absolutes soften, and where what's considered truth becomes dictated by consensus, not conviction. It acknowledged that the world was moving toward a convergence, a unification, that on the surface seems like peace, but for those who understand prophecy, for those who study patterns of power throughout history, it reeks of something far more sinister. Because every empire, every oppressive regime, every carefully manipulated society throughout time has relied on one thing to maintain control: the merging of belief systems under a singular authority. And when religious leaders start echoing the language of global policymakers, when spiritual shepherds begin to sound like politicians in robes, that's when you know the shift is underway. People don't realize how subtle these moments are. They expect earth-shattering declarations, flashing warnings, and breaking news banners. But real danger never arrives like that. It comes softly. It hides in moments of diplomacy, in words about unity, in speeches about tolerance. It wraps itself in virtue so that when you question it, you seem like the problem. That's how deception works. And what the Pope admitted wasn't terrifying because of its volume. It was terrifying because of its timing. In a world already reeling from moral confusion, cultural division, and spiritual apathy, this admission wasn't just a reflection of where we are. It was a cue for where we're going. It was confirmation that the veil between what we see and what's really happening is thinner than most dare to believe. And while millions will dismiss it as harmless, as progressive, as necessary for a changing world, the spiritually awake will feel that chill, that unshakable sense that a line was crossed, even if most didn't notice. There's a reason prophetic texts spoke about religious leaders playing a role in the final deception. There's a reason history shows us that every great manipulation began with words dressed as peace. And now, as those words leave the mouths of the highest spiritual authorities, you can feel it: the quiet before the storm, the careful conditioning of the masses, the normalization of ideas that even a decade ago would have been unthinkable. But here's the truth. The ones who are awake, the ones with eyes to see and ears to hear, already knew this day would come. And while it's disturbing to witness, it's also a strange kind of validation, a reminder that intuition wasn't paranoia, that the whispers you felt in your spirit, the unease in your gut when watching the world shift, it was real. And moments like this only confirm it. Because when a man like that steps to the microphone and says what he just said, it's not for debate. It's not speculation. It's a marker. A signpost planted firmly in history that says from this point on, things will be different. And whether you choose to stay blind or open your eyes is on you, but understand this. Darkness never announces itself as darkness. It comes as light. It promises peace. It speaks of unity. And it wears the mask of tolerance. What terrifies me isn't just what was said, it's the reaction or lack of it. The silence from those who should be alarmed. The applause from those too naive or too complicit to grasp what's unfolding. Because silence in the face of deception is itself a form of agreement. And as long as the masses remain entertained, distracted, or too exhausted to care, the agenda moves forward unopposed. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a carefully placed seed, watered by decades of spiritual compromise, now beginning to break the surface. And though the full bloom of what it will become is still ahead, make no mistake, the soil is ready. The conditions are perfect, and the clock is ticking. For those who understand the weight of moments like this, it's time to sharpen your discernment, to steady your soul, because if this is what's being admitted publicly, imagine what's being discussed behind closed doors. See, the thing about moments like this, when a major religious figure steps forward and lets a chilling truth slip from his lips, is that it's never truly random. People might tell themselves it was an offhand comment, a misunderstood phrase, or an innocent observation, but those who pay attention know better. Nothing at this level happens by accident. In fact, when you trace the pattern of world events, spiritual warnings, and cultural shifts over the past few decades, you realize this was inevitable. The signs have always been there. The world has been moving toward this for a long time, inch by inch, degree by degree. And for anyone with the eyes to see, it's been clear as day. The unsettling part is that most people never saw it coming, not because the signs weren't obvious, but because they didn't want to see them. It's easier to stay numb, to laugh off what seems too uncomfortable to confront, to convince yourself that everything is fine, that the world is chaotic but manageable. Yet if you look back, you'll realize the road to this moment was carefully paved. Every headline, every crisis, every policy shift, every strange decision by those in power, it was all connected. And what just happened wasn't the start of something new, it was the public acknowledgement of something that's been quietly moving behind the scenes for years. Think about how often we've seen moral standards flipped on their heads, how what was once considered wrong is now celebrated, and what was once noble is now mocked. It didn't happen overnight, it came in waves. A small compromise here, a softened stance there, a necessary change in tradition for the sake of progress, and before anyone knew it, the world they lived in looked nothing like the one they were born into. That's how it works. The enemy of truth doesn't crash through the front door, it seeps through the cracks. This moment with the Pope is a prime example of that. It wasn't a sudden turn. If you go back, you'll see the breadcrumbs, the subtle endorsements of ideas that blurred the lines between faith and politics, the increasing push for global unity under the banner of religious tolerance, the gradual replacement of absolute moral truth with relative cultural value. It's been a slow burn, one that lulled people into a false sense of security while conditioning them to accept what they would have once rejected. And it's no coincidence that this is happening now. Look around. The world is at a boiling point. Political systems are collapsing. Economies are unstable. Natural disasters are escalating. There's unrest in every corner of the planet. Fear and confusion are the dominant emotions of this generation. And when people are afraid, when they feel like the world is spiraling out of control, they'll cling to anything that promises peace. That's exactly when those in power make their move, because a desperate population is a compliant population. You see it in history. Every great empire that fell did so after moral decay set in. When truth became negotiable, when leadership became corrupt, when society's foundations were eroded from within, collapse was inevitable. And before the fall, there was always a moment, a statement, a decision, a public shift that marked the point of no return. That's what this admission feels like. Not because it started something new, but because it confirmed what many of us have sensed for years: the global unification of belief systems, the erasure of spiritual distinctions, the merging of politics and faith into a single controllable entity. It's been the plan. It's why religious leaders have slowly started speaking the same language as global organizations. It's why moral absolutes have been replaced with slogans about inclusivity and tolerance that sound harmless but carry dangerous implications. And it's why prophetic warnings in ancient texts feel more relevant now than they ever have. People have been so conditioned to dismiss anything labeled as prophecy or spiritual discernment that they don't realize how many of those old words are playing out before their eyes. Wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes in diverse places, a generation that calls evil good and good evil, the rise of leaders promising peace while laying the groundwork for control. It's all there. It always was. This is why what the Pope admitted matters. It wasn't about one sentence. It was about the timing, the delivery, and the fact that it came on the heels of so many other global shifts. When you stack this on top of everything else, the rise of artificial intelligence systems designed to monitor populations, digital currencies poised to replace cash, worldwide surveillance becoming normalized, and the increasing hostility toward traditional faith, it paints a very clear picture. And for those still on the fence, still thinking it's just coincidence or overreaction, ask yourself this: how many coincidences does it take before you start calling it a pattern? How many warnings need to be ignored before you realize they weren't random? Because history doesn't repeat itself by accident. It does so because people refuse to learn from it. And right now we're watching the very playbook that destroyed ancient empires being dusted off and used again. The scary part isn't that the admission happened, it's that so few people noticed and even fewer cared. That's always the most dangerous moment in any society, when evil stops hiding and no one blinks. Because when darkness can speak in daylight without resistance, it means it no longer fears exposure. But those who are awake, who see the signs, understand that these moments aren't meant to terrify us into paralysis. They're meant to jolt us into awareness, to remind us that time is short, that we were never meant to blend into a culture bent on its own destruction, and that our discernment is our weapon. What just happened is proof that we are further along this path than most are willing to admit. And while the masses may stay distracted, the watchman on the wall must stay alert. Now here's where it gets unsettling on a different level, not just what was said, but what it implies beneath the surface. Because see, whenever a figure of that magnitude makes a public admission like this, it's never about the surface level message. It's always about what lies underneath, the things unsaid, the intentions carefully cloaked behind gentle words and calls for unity. And if you listen closely, if you really pay attention to the language and the timing, you realize there's an agenda moving behind this moment, one with spiritual consequences far heavier than most can imagine. For years there's been this steady campaign to soften convictions, to blur the edges of truth, and to present the idea that all belief systems can and should merge under one banner of peace. On the surface it sounds noble. Who doesn't want peace? Who wouldn't desire a world where conflict over religion, culture, and faith disappears? But what they don't tell you is the cost. What they won't say openly is that peace without principle, unity without truth, and tolerance without discernment is a dangerous illusion. And this is where the hidden agenda reveals itself, not in what's declared, but in what's being prepared behind closed doors. Look back over the last few decades and notice how often powerful figures, whether religious, political, or cultural, have started to echo the same language. Phrases like global citizenship, universal faith, coexistence through compromise, and a new world moral order. It's subtle, it's gradual, but it's relentless. And the admission that came out of the Pope's mouth didn't just hint at future changes. It signaled the fact that this unification isn't coming, it's already here, quietly building its framework while the masses stay distracted. The terrifying thing isn't even that leaders are speaking about it now. It's that people are no longer alarmed when they do. This kind of spiritual manipulation works best when it happens slowly, almost invisibly, until one day it's normal. Until one day what used to sound outrageous now sounds reasonable. And that's where we are. The merging of politics and spirituality, of governments and religious systems, is well underway. So it's not a theory anymore, it's a reality. And this latest admission was like pulling back the curtain for just a moment, enough for those who are awake to glimpse what's coming. Because the hidden agenda is control, plain and simple. And history shows us that the most effective way to control a population isn't just through laws or military force, but through belief systems. If you can get people to believe the same thing, to trust the same leaders, to accept a singular version of truth, you can guide them anywhere. And when those belief systems are fused with global governance, it becomes almost impossible to resist. You see it happening already. The language of global unity sounds harmless at first. Phrases like one humanity, shared values, and world peace are dressed in the language of compassion. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find clauses about restructuring religious doctrine, about eliminating divisive beliefs, about redefining truth as something flexible and negotiable. And it always starts with small compromises, faith leaders aligning themselves with political agendas, sacred texts being reinterpreted to fit new narratives, ancient prophecies being dismissed as outdated superstition. And now, when a figure like the Pope openly suggests changes or adjustments to long-standing spiritual truths in the name of progress, it's not just a conversation starter, it's a move in a much larger strategy. Because once the highest spiritual authorities endorse certain ideas, the rest of the religious world follows. Smaller churches, communities, and individual believers begin to mirror the language and accept the shifts, often without realizing how much ground they've surrendered. And here's where the spiritual implications grow heavy. Because this isn't just about organized religion. It's about what happens to people's souls when absolute truths are dismantled. When people lose their moral anchor, they drift. They become easier to sway, easier to manipulate, easier to control. And in times of crisis, when wars rage, economies collapse, and fear spreads like wildfire, people will cling to whatever promises stability. That's when this new, carefully constructed belief system steps in, not as a suggestion, but as a requirement. This is why ancient prophetic texts warned about a time when deception would come through peace, when leaders would promise safety and unity while laying the groundwork for spiritual enslavement. It was never going to arrive through violence. It was always going to come dressed in compassion, the kind of deception that feels good, sounds righteous, and leaves people defenseless because they never saw it as a threat. And make no mistake, this is spiritual warfare on a global scale. Because what's happening now isn't just about politics or power. It's about capturing hearts and minds. It's about replacing personal conviction with collective ideology, about trading a connection to the divine for loyalty to a system. That's what these admissions, these speeches, these global declarations are really about. And if this is what they're comfortable saying out loud, imagine what's being plotted in private, behind closed doors, away from cameras and press releases. Strategies are being laid, strategies to reshape faith, to merge belief systems under one rule, to create a version of spirituality so sanitized and diluted that it offends no one but saves no one either. A faith that asks for nothing, requires no sacrifice, and conveniently aligns with whatever political or social trend is most profitable. That's the goal. A world where no one stands for anything, where truth is fluid, and where obedience is disguised as virtue. And while many won't recognize it until it's too late, those who stay spiritually awake can see the path being paved. That's why this admission was terrifying, because it was another stone laid in that path. Not the beginning, not the end, but a significant, undeniable marker that this isn't speculation anymore. It's happening right now, in real time. The wise will pay attention, the foolish will laugh it off, and the blind will follow wherever they're led. And here's where it reaches its most disturbing truth. It's not just about what was said, not just about the agenda quietly moving underneath it, but about what this moment actually signals for the future. Because admissions like this aren't made unless the people in power believe the population is either too blind, too numb, or too distracted to resist it. The terrifying reality is that we have arrived at a place in history where such confessions can be made publicly in broad daylight without immediate outrage. And that says more about the condition of humanity than it does about any leader. The chilling part is how predictable it all is. Because every empire, every society heading toward collapse follows the same pattern. First comes moral decay, then spiritual apathy, then the merging of belief systems under a single authority, and finally the complete erosion of personal freedoms in exchange for the illusion of peace and safety. It's a cycle older than civilization itself, and every generation tells itself it won't fall for it, that this time is different, yet here we are. The Pope's admission, whether people realize it or not, was a signpost. A public confirmation that we've crossed a line we can't easily step back from. It's a statement that the conditioning phase is over, and now we're in the normalization phase, the phase where the most alarming changes to faith, morality, and social order are no longer whispered in back rooms, but announced boldly, dressed in soft words like progress. And if you think this ends with one man making one statement, you haven't been paying attention. This is how global systems take control, not overnight, but over decades, not through war, but through language, through emotional manipulation, through reframing what people believe is right, necessary, and moral. And once enough people are numb to it, the floodgates open. That's what makes this so terrifying, not just that it's happening, but that most people won't realize it until it's far too late. And understand, this was never just about religion, it was always about power. Because those in control have long known that if you control a person's beliefs, You control their behavior. You control their fears, their loyalties, their values. And when faith becomes a tool of the system rather than a compass of personal conviction, you've created the perfect population, one that obeys without question and condemns anyone who refuses to kneel to the new order. That's what makes this recent admission such a monumental shift. It wasn't just a passing comment, it was a message to those paying attention. We've reached the stage where the veil can be lifted, where the agenda can stop pretending to be what it isn't, where leaders can start saying out loud what they've been orchestrating behind closed doors for years because they believe you won't fight back. And if you do, they believe you'll be too isolated, too ridiculed, too demonized by the masses to make a difference. But here's the thing. This isn't the first time humanity has faced a deception this massive. History is full of warnings, of ancient texts that described exactly how these moments would come, that before the end there would be a merging of power and religion, a false promise of peace, a blurring of moral lines, and a population too sedated by entertainment, fear, and false security to resist it. And if you've ever read those warnings, you'll recognize the pattern instantly. That's what makes what happened so terrifying, not because it was new, but because it was expected. Because for those who've stayed spiritually awake, this was one of the signs, the quiet before the storm. The moment when deception stops hiding, when what was once theory becomes obvious, and those still denying it can no longer claim ignorance, only willful blindness. And the sad truth is, most people will choose the comfort of denial over the discomfort of truth. Because waking up to this reality means acknowledging that the world you thought you understood was a carefully constructed illusion. That the people you trusted to guide you both spiritually and politically were never working in your best interest. That's a hard thing for anyone to face. They'll rationalize it, laugh it off, call it conspiracy, because it's easier to mock the warning than to admit you're living in its fulfillment. But for those with the courage to see, this moment is a gift, a confirmation that intuition wasn't paranoia, that those restless nights, those unshakable feelings that something isn't right, were your spirit sounding the alarm. And now it's clearer than ever that the time to get serious about where you stand, spiritually, morally, and personally, isn't next year, next month, or even next week, but now. Because if you wait for the next admission, the next global declaration, the next change in doctrine or policy, you'll find yourself deeper in a system designed to strip you of the ability to resist. That's the terrifying part, that so many don't realize how quickly the window is closing, that the same cycle of history is playing out again right in front of them while they stare down at their phones, distracted by 1,000 meaningless things. And for those who say, well, what can we do about it? The answer is what it's always been. Stay awake. Stay grounded in truth that doesn't shift with the culture. Refuse to compromise when compromise means surrendering your soul. Understand that while you might not be able to stop the wave from coming, you don't have to drown it. You can be the one who stands firm when everyone else bows down. You can be the one voice of clarity in a world drunk on confusion. This moment was an accident. It was a warning, one that's only terrifying to those who aren't ready. And this brings us to perhaps the most sobering truth of all, the aftermath. The silent ripple effect that moments like this leave behind. Because, see, people assume that once a statement is made, once a declaration like this comes from the mouth of a globally recognized religious leader, it either causes an instant uproar or fades quickly into irrelevance. But what they don't realize is that the most dangerous words ever spoken are not the ones that spark immediate riots. They're the ones that settle deep into the subconscious of a generation, the ones that quietly reshape culture, belief, and behavior without anyone realizing it happened. What happened here with this admission is exactly that kind of moment. It wasn't designed to ignite instant backlash. It was meant to test the waters, to gauge how much resistance was left in people's hearts, to see how conditioned the population had become, how softened, how numbed to bold-faced shifts in spiritual and moral authority. And frighteningly, the world's reaction proved what those in power hoped, that most people no longer care enough to fight. Or worse, they agree. This is the stage where the final groundwork is laid. Because once you can make a statement like this and watch as the majority either dismiss it, justify it, or remain indifferent to it, you gain something far more valuable than control. You gain consent. Silent consent. Passive agreement. Because in this system, silence is agreement. A population that stays quiet in the face of spiritual compromise will inevitably accept the next step and then the next. It's a desensitization process, gradual, intentional, and devastating. Look back through history and you'll see this isn't new. Every regime, every global power shift, every era of mass deception has followed this same pattern. The leaders never start with sweeping mandates. They begin with small, seemingly harmless changes, adjustments to language. Public figures subtly endorsing new ideas, shifting what is considered offensive or inappropriate, reframing ancient values as outdated. And once the public stops reacting, the real agenda begins. That's what's so terrifying about this moment. It isn't just what the Pope admitted, but what the world's response to it revealed. That people have become so detached from spiritual discernment, so unwilling to confront uncomfortable realities, that they'd rather be lied to gently than face the truth boldly. And that makes this generation dangerously vulnerable. Vulnerable to deception, manipulation, and eventual submission to a system designed to control not just how they live, but how they believe, how they think, and ultimately how they worship. And don't think for a second this was just about religion in the traditional sense. This isn't about denominations or doctrines anymore. It's about control of the human spirit, about replacing timeless absolute truths with a new form of global spirituality, one designed to unite the world under a single, malleable, non-threatening belief system, one stripped of conviction, one that offends no one because it stands for nothing. And the most effective way to introduce this is by first causing division within existing faith structures. That's already begun. You can see it in churches, where leaders now prioritize social popularity over spiritual truth. In religious organizations where ancient texts are being reinterpreted to suit modern trends. In spiritual communities where standing firm on absolute beliefs is labeled as intolerant or backward. It's all part of the same pattern: divide, confuse, and then unify under something new. And with every public admission like the one we just witnessed, the foundation of traditional faith weakens, while the framework of this new system strengthens. The aftermath of this moment will not be loud. It will be quiet, subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer. You'll notice it in future speeches, in the next global summit, in the carefully crafted statements from faith leaders who'll start echoing the same phrases, in media narratives that slowly reframe ancient beliefs as dangerous or outdated, in public policy decisions designed to protect the global community by restricting dissent. The aftermath will be slow, deliberate erosion. And the terrifying truth is, once this new system fully takes hold, there will be no going back. because unlike past regimes, this one won't rule through obvious tyranny, but through a sophisticated, digital, surveillance-driven, psychologically conditioned system of control, where morality is decided by consensus, where religious conviction is considered dangerous extremism, where refusing to conform isn't just unpopular, it's punishable. This is where the admission we just heard is leading. And the saddest part is that the masses will beg for it, out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of a desperate hunger for peace and stability, and because the deception will come wrapped in beautiful language about unity, love, and safety, many won't recognize it until they're fully inside the trap. But the truly terrifying thing, what keeps people up at night when they finally see it, is realizing how few people are even willing to have this conversation. How conditioned we become to avoid conflict, to reject anything that disturbs our comfort, to dismiss warnings as paranoia, that silence is the most dangerous aftermath of all. Because evil only needs one thing to triumph for good people to stay silent. And if history has taught us anything, it's that by the time the majority wakes up, the system is already too deeply rooted to dismantle. That's why this moment matters. That's why the world's reaction to it matters even more. Because it's not just a reflection of what one man said, it's a reflection of what humanity is willing to accept. And in times like these, the quiet aftermath of a single statement can reshape the course of history.